Before we begin, I want to warn you that this story contains mature themes. It deals with the challenges of new motherhood, family relationships, and infidelity. If these topics make you uncomfortable, you might want to stop watching now. I'm Mary. I'm 42 years old, and I guess you could say my life is unconventional. If you had told me 10 years ago that this is where I'd end up, I probably would have laughed in your face, but here I am, sitting in my kitchen, staring at a half-empty cup of coffee, trying to make sense of everything. That's happened. It's been just me and my son Tommy for the last 8 years. Ever since the divorce, it's felt like the two of us against the world. He was only 10 when his dad walked out. He didn't cry, not in front of me at least, but I could see it in his eyes. The way he'd sit by the window and wait, like maybe today his dad would come back. Of course, he never did. I made a promise to myself back then. I swore I'd do whatever it took to make Tommy feel like he still had a family, even if it was just the two of us. And for a while, I think I managed to hold things together. He was such a sweet kid, kind, quiet, always trying to help me around the house. But as he got older, things started to change. He started to change. And if I'm being honest, so did I. Tommy turned 18 this year. He's not a kid anymore, but sometimes I think he's still trying to figure out what it means to be a man. He's always been a little reserved. He doesn't go out much, doesn't really have close friends. I've tried to talk to him about it, but he just shrugs it off. Says he's fine. I know he's not fine. Though a mother always knows, about a month ago he came to me with something I never expected, something I wasn't ready to hear. He told me he'd been using my things, my underwear. At first I didn't understand what he meant, and when I did, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I wanted to yell, to scream, to demand what the hell he was thinking, but I didn't. He looked so ashamed, so embarrassed, sitting there with his head down, unable to meet my eyes, and in that moment I realized something. This wasn't just about what he'd done. This was about what he was feeling, about what he couldn't say. He wasn't some pervert or some monster. He was my son, and he was struggling with feelings he didn't understand, with urges he couldn't control, and he couldn't bring myself to make him feel worse than he already did. So I made a choice. I made a deal with him. I told him he could do what he needed to do, but there would be rules. He could rally himself, but he had to do it in front of me. That way, I could make sure he was safe, that he wasn't crossing any more lines in exchange. I told him I'd bring whoever I wanted into the house without him questioning or judging me. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the only one I could think of in the moment. Since then, things have been different. Tommy seems more relaxed now, less on edge. He still doesn't talk much, but he doesn't avoid me like he used to. Me. Well, I've started to realize that this arrangement isn't just for him, it's for me too. It gives me the freedom I've been craving for years, the freedom to live my life without feeling like I have to tiptoe around him. Sometimes late at night, I sit up and wonder if I made the right choice. I wonder what people would think if they knew. Would they call me a bad mother, a failure? Maybe they would, but they don't know Tommy. They don't know what it's like to see your child hurting and not know how to fix it. They don't know what it's like to feel like you're barely holding everything together, just trying to keep from falling apart. I don't know what the future holds for us. I don't know if this arrangement will work long term or if it's just a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. But for now, this is our life. This is what we've chosen. And as messy and complicated as it is, I am doing the best I can for him. For both of us. If you're still with me, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this. Trust me, there's so much more to uncover. The deal wasn't something I planned. It wasn't something I thought through. It just happened. One moment I was sitting there trying to figure out how to talk to Tommy about what he told me, and the next the words were spilling out of my mouth like they had a mind of their own. "You can keep doing it," I said, "but I need some things in return." He looked at me like I'd just spoken in another language. His face went pale, his hands clenched into fists on the kitchen table for a second. I thought he was going to get up and walk out. Maybe I wanted him to, maybe I was hoping he'd say no, that he'd tell me I was crazy and storm out of the room, but he didn't. He just sat there, staring at me, his mouth opening and closing, like he didn't know what to say. "What do you mean?" he finally asked. His voice was shaky, quiet, like he wasn't sure if he really wanted to know the answer. I took a deep breath. "I mean, you can keep doing it, but only in front of me, and in return, I get to live my life the way I want. I get to bring people into the house without you saying anything about it. No judgment, no questions. We both get what we need. Okay?" There was a long silence after that. Tommy didn't say a word. He just stared at me, his brow furrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. I could tell he was trying to process what I just said, trying to make sense of it. I was doing the same thing. The words were out there, now hanging in the air between us, and I couldn't take them back. Not that I was sure I wanted to. Finally, he nodded just a little, barely enough to notice. "Okay," he said, his voice so soft. I almost didn't hear it. "If that's what you want." And that was it. That was the deal. The first time it happened, I thought I was going to throw up. I sat on the edge of my bed, my heart pounding in my chest, my palms sweating. I told myself that this was what he needed, that it was better than alternative, that I was doing this for him, but deep down I knew. It was that simple. It never ever is. He walked into the room, his eyes glued to the floor. He didn't say anything, neither did I. We didn't look at each other, not really. I just sat there, pretending like it wasn't happening, like this was just another normal day. And I didn't see him. When it was over, he left. Left without a word. I didn't move for a long time after that. I just sat there, staring at the wall, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that this was fine. It's strange the things you can get used to at first. Every time felt like a punch to the gut. But over time it got easier, or maybe I just got better at pretending it didn't bother me. I told myself it wasn't hurting anyone, that it was just different. I told myself I was being practical, that I was making the best out of a bad situation, and for a while I believed it. Tommy, on the other hand, was a different story. He tried to act like everything was fine, but I could see it in his eyes, the shame, the guilt. He never said it out loud, but I knew he hated himself for needing this, for needing me. And every time I saw that look on his face, it broke my heart a little more. But what was I supposed to do? He was my son, my only child. I couldn't turn my back on him. I couldn't let him drown in his own feelings while I stood by and watched. So I did what I always do. I put on a brave face and pushed forward for him, for me, for us. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing most days. I'm not even sure what right thing is anymore, but this is where we are. This is the life we've built, and for now it's enough. It has to be. At first, it wasn't so different. Tommy stuck to the routine, if you could even call it that. Once in the morning, sometimes again in the evening. It wasn't predictable, but it was manageable. I told myself this was just a phase, that he'd get tired of it, that it would taper off once the no yaha wore off, but I was wrong. Instead of slowing down, it only picked up, slowly at first. A morning turned into an afternoon and then into a night, then 2 mornings back to back. I started noticing how quickly the hours in the day began to revolve around this arrangement. There were fewer stretches of normally, fewer moments when the air in the house didn't feel heavy with what we'd agreed to. I tried to ignore it, to push it to the back of my mind, but it was always there, lingering like a shadow. The first time I felt uneasy about it, I was in the middle of folding laundry. Tommy walked in without saying a word, his expression tense, his body language stiff. I knew what he wanted. Before he even said anything, I put the clothes down and I sat on the edge of the couch waiting for him to finish, but something was different this time. He didn't just leave when it was over, he lingered, looking at me like he was trying to say something but couldn't find the words. I felt my stomach tighten, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a stone. "You okay?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He nodded, but I could see it in his eyes. This wasn't about relief anymore. It was something more. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the day over and over in my mind. I told myself not to overthink it, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't just a way for him to cope anymore. It was something he was starting to need, something he was beginning to rely on. And the scariest part was I wasn't sure how to stop it. In the days that followed, Tommy's behavior shifted even more. He stopped trying to hide it, stopped waiting for the right moments. It was like he didn't care about boundaries anymore, like the deal made was a free pass to do whatever he wanted whenever he wanted. And maybe it was I had given him the freedom to do this, hadn't I? The first time I teased him, it was an accident. I was in the kitchen making dinner when he walked in. I could feel him watching me as I moved around, his eyes following my every step. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted to break the tension, or maybe I was testing him, seeing how far he'd go. But without thinking, I slipped my jacket off, letting it fall onto the counter. His breath hitched, and I turned to face him, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "Something wrong?" I asked, pretending not to notice the way his cheeks flushed. He didn't answer. He just turned and left the room, but I could feel the weight of his gaze lingering even after he was gone. After that, it became a game. I'd pull my hair up, let my shirt ride up just a little too high. I leave my jeans unbuttoned a little too long. Nothing explicit, nothing overt, just enough to make him squirm, to make him hesitate before turning away. It gave me a strange sense of control, a power I hadn't felt in years. And I hated how much I liked it, but with every passing day, the line between us blurred a little more. He started seeking me out more often, finding excuses to be near me even when he didn't need to be. And I told myself it was harmless, that it didn't mean anything. But the truth was, I wasn't sure what it meant anymore. I wasn't sure of anything anymore. There was a moment late one evening when it all came to a head. Tommy was sitting across from me in the living room, his eyes fixed on me as I read a book. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the kind that made your skin prickle and your heart race. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and for the first time, I didn't look away. Neither did he. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, until I finally cleared my throat and stood up. "I'm going to bed," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, but I could feel his eyes on me as I walked away. I don't know how we got here. I don't know how I let it get this far, but here we are, caught in a cycle. I'm not sure how to break, and as much as I want to believe I'm still in control, I can't shake the feeling that I've already lost it. It wasn't until Enrique Franklin entered our lives that everything began to unravel. I met him through a friend, one of those casual introductions that you never think much about at first, but Enrique wasn't the kind of man you could easily forget. He was charming in a way that felt effortless, like he didn't have to try to make you smile. He had this laugh that filled a room, warm and disarming. He made me feel lighter, like maybe for the first time in years, I could let my guard down. Enrique started coming over more often. At first, it was just for dinner or a drink on the back porch, but soon he was staying later, lingering in the living room after Tommy had retreated to his room. And then one night, he didn't leave at all. I didn't try to hide it from Tommy. That wasn't part of our deal, after all. Still, I couldn't ignore the look on his face the next morning when he saw Enrique sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee like he'd been there for years. It was subtle, but I knew my son well enough to recognize the tension in his jaw, the way his hands tightened around his plate, just a little too hard at first. Tommy didn't say anything. He just watched from the edges, quiet and sullen, but as the weeks went by Enrique's presence in our house became more frequent. His silence turned into something sharper. He started snapping at me over little things, forgotten errands, mismatched socks, trivial annoyances that seemed to take on a life of their own. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just his way of adjusting. But the truth was, I could feel the resentment growing between us, thick and heavy like a storm waiting to break. One evening, as Andre and I sat on the couch laughing over something silly, Tommy walked into the room. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching us with an expression I couldn't quite place. When I looked up, met his eyes, I saw it. The hurt, the anger, the confusion that had been bubbling beneath the surface for weeks before I could say anything. He spoke, his voice low and trembling. "Do you even care anymore?" He said, his words cutting through the air like a knife. Henry looked at me, startled, but I didn't take my eyes off Tommy. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice steady even though my heart was racing. He took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't care about me, about us, about what we're doing has done to me?" The room went silent. Even Enrique didn't dare to move. I stood up slowly, my chest tight, as I searched Tommy's face for some kind of explanation. "Tommy, that's not true," I said. Softly, "Of course I care about you. Everything I've done, everything I've been doing is for you, for me." he shot back, his voice rising. How is any of this for me? You let this guy waltz into our lives like it's nothing. You sit there and laugh with him like I don't even exist. I felt the air leave my lungs. His words hitting me harder than I expected. Tommy, I said, reaching out to him, but he pulled way before I could touch him. I didn't know you felt this way. Of course you didn't, he said bitterly. You're too busy with your freedom or whatever it is you think this is. Do you even see me anymore, or am I just convenient? The silence that followed was deafening. Enrique shifted uncomfortably on the couch, muttering something about giving a space before slipping out the door. I barely noticed. All I could see was my son standing there, trembling with emotions I'd ignored for far too long. That night after Tommy stormed off to his room, I sat alone in the living room staring at the empty coffee cup. Enrique had left behind. His words kept replaying in my head over and over, each one cutting a little deeper than the last. He was right. I hadn't been thinking about him, not really. I'd been so focused on trying to make this situation work, on convincing myself that everything was fine, that I hadn't stopped to think about what it was doing to him and us. For the first time in a long time, I felt the full weight of my choices. The deal I'd made with Tommy, the boundaries we'd crossed, the lines we'd blurred. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about what we were becoming and the damage we were leaving in our wake. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, staring at the door, wondering if there was still a way to fix this or if it was already too late. The day after our argument, the house was unnervingly quiet. Tommy stayed in his room, the door closed, and the air heavy with unspoken tension. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee, the steam curling up like a fog clouding my thoughts. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to do something, whatever this was. Whatever we had turned our relationship into, it couldn't go on like this. Not for him, not for me. Later that afternoon, I knocked on his door. There was no answer at first, but I waited, pressing my forehead against the wooden frame. "Tommy, please, I need to talk to you," I said softly. Finally, the door creaked open and he stood there, his face guarded and his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "I'm sorry." "Sorry," I said, my voice trembling, "for everything. For not seeing how much this has hurt you, for letting things get this far. I was wrong." His expression didn't soften immediately, but he stepped aside to let me in. I sat on the edge of his bed while he leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. "We need help," I admitted. "Both of us. I can't keep pretending like I know what I'm doing, and I can't let us keep going down this path. I've already made too many mistakes. But I want to try to fix them, if you'll let me." Tommy didn't say much at first. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. But a few days later, we were sitting in a small office across from Rafael Cabrera, a family therapist I'd found online. Rafael was a kind man, his demeanor calm and steady in a way that made you feel safe even when you didn't want to talk. And at first, neither of us did. We sat in silence. The weight of our story too much to put into words. But Raphael had a way of breaking through that silence, asking questions that didn't feel like prying but like invitations, slowly. Tommy began to open up. He talked about the loneliness he'd felt since the divorce, the confusion he carried about our arrangement, and the resentment that had been building inside him. I listened, tears streaming down my face as I heard him put words to feel feelings I'd ignored for far too long. In the weeks that followed, therapy became a part of our routine. It wasn't easy. There were days when we left the office more drained than when we arrived, days when I questioned if we were really making progress, but bit by bit the walls between us began to come down. Raphael helped us set boundaries, real boundaries this time. I told Tommy that our deal was over, that it had been a mistake, and that we needed to start fresh. At first, he struggled to adjust. There were moments when I caught him retreating to old habits, his frustration boiling over into anger or tears. But with Raphael's guidance, we found healthier ways to cope. Tommy started journaling, something I never thought he'd try, and even joined a local martial arts class where he found an outlet for his emotions. Slowly, I saw him change. He stood a little taller, spoke a little more confidently, and began spending more time out of the house, building connections that weren't tethered to me. For me, the hardest part was facing myself, really facing myself. Therapy forced me to confront the choices I'd made, the ways I'd let my own fears and insecurities dictate my relationship with Tommy. I'd spent so much time trying to hold on to him, to fill the void left by the divorce, that I hadn't seen how it was suffocating us both. Letting go of that control, learning to trust that he could stand on his own, was one of the hardest things I've ever done. One evening, months after our first therapy session, Tommy and I were sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He looked over at me and said, "Thanks, Mom, for everything." It wasn't much, but it was enough. I reached over and squeezed his hand, the kind of simple gesture that spoke volumes without needing words. We still figuring things out. Healing isn't a straight line. It's messy and complicated and full of setbacks. But for the first time in a long time, I feel hopeful. Tommy is finding his way, and so am I. And while we may never fully erase the mistakes we've made, we're learning how to move forward together. Life doesn't come with a manual. And if it did, I probably would have thrown mine out a long time ago. Tommy and I have been through more than I ever imagined we could handle, but somehow we're still here, still trying, still learning. The house feels different now, like lighter. Maybe there's a kind of peace that comes from knowing we're finally working towards something better. Tommy has found his footing. He spends more time out with friends, more time focusing on his own interests. When we do cross paths, it feels like we're meeting as individuals, not as two people tied up in a messy arrangement we didn't fully understand. We still have our moments, of course. Healing isn't perfect, but it's progress for me. It's been a journey of facing myself. I've had to learn to forgive my own mistakes, to let go of the guilt that weighed me down for so long. I've had to accept that I can't always fix things, and sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you love is to step back and let them figure it out for themselves. It hasn't been easy, but I'm proud of the progress we've made, not just as a mother and son, but as two people learning how to respect and trust each other again. If there's one thing I've taken away from all of this, it's the importance of boundaries, real ones. They're not just rules, they're acts of love. Love for the people around you and love for yourself. They're how you protect what matters while still allowing room for growth, for understanding, for connection. I've learned that accountability is just as important as forgiveness, that sometimes the hardest thing you can do is admit you've been wrong, but it's also the most freeing. To anyone listening, I want to say this: mistakes don't define you. What defines you is what you do after, how you pick yourself up, how you face the people you've hurt, and how you move forward. Growth isn't about being perfect, it's about being willing to change, even when it scares you, even when it hurts. Tommy and I are still figuring things out, and I think we always will be. That's just life. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like we're on solid ground. We're building something better, something healthier, and I know we'll keep moving forward together either way. I want to hear what you think. Tell me, what would you do if your world fell apart like mine did? How would you move forward? Let me know in the comments. And if this story made you feel something, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.